evening, everybody. How are y'all doing? Good. Ready for another lecture? Awesome. My name is Charlotte. I'm the executive director here at the Highlands Biological Foundation, and we have hit our stride this summer. This is our third Zahner conservation lecture. We've already had two wonderful ones, and we know tonight will be no different. We also invite you to keep coming back next Thursday. You want to grab one of these great schedules, they're by the back door. We have Dr. Rod Young from Western talking about managing coastal zones and the effect climate change is having on our coasts, especially in North Carolina. So come back next week for that. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by two of our very favorite family supporters. We have Miriam and Vernon Skiles and Mary Todd and Judy Davis. They have a wonderful reception for you, and they even brought their own flower arrangements, flowers grown in their yards, arranged outside, so be sure to enjoy those. Have a snack, have a glass of wine, and stick around, because you can also get these books written by our speaker. She'll be out there signing, so be sure to grab these and meet her on your way out. All right, I'm going to read a little introduction, and then we'll turn this over to Georgann. So Georgann Eubanks is a writer, consultant, and the executive director of the Paul Green Foundation. She's a consultant with over 30 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. She's published 5 books at the University of North Carolina Press and is an Emmy-winning documentarian. She has served as chair of the North Carolina Humanities, president of Arts North Carolina, president of the North Carolina Literary and Historical Association, and last year, she was named executive director of the Paul Green Foundation, making her the literary executor for the works of North Carolina's most celebrated playwright, the late Paul Green. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Georgann. Thank you for coming.
Here. I grew up in Atlanta, so I guess I almost qualify as being from Highlands, right? It's really an honor to be here. As Donna Campbell, who was the photographer for the book, pointed out, I've given 30, 40 talks about this book now since October. This is the first time I've spoken in a room with live snakes, as far as I know. I'm not a botanist. I'm not a professor. I'm a writer, and I have curiosity, and that's what led me to this book. I'll say a word about the book before this one that was held up. The first book, or the last book before this one, was on North Carolina heritage foods. And I got very curious about those dishes that are ephemeral, that come out just one time a year, and we all long for them until that season comes. And so I picked a food, 12 foods through the year, and traveled around the state and talked to people about the history of the food. It's not really a cookbook. It's got a couple of recipes, but it's really about our cultural heritage as North Carolinians and the things that we love to long for. I realized recently in my food blog that I blew it because I left out peaches. I just wrote a column about peaches, and I've never had such a response. People just long and wait for peaches. Now, I grew up in Georgia, and that was definitely a topic. And I thought, well, that's not really a North Carolina fruit in the same way that some other things are. So I guess I kind of blew it. But I get to keep writing about food in my blog. While I was working on this food book, I learned that ramps, you all know what ramps are, the garlicky greens that come up in March here in the North Carolina mountains, that the Cherokee have eaten for 3,000 years. And ramps were getting poached and pulled up all over the place and almost getting to the point of being endangered because so many chefs have started using them in elegant dishes at fancy restaurants. Ramps sell for $20 and upward a pound in New York City. Our soft-shell crab are in trouble because of stormwater runoff, because of competition from Asian markets. Our oysters are also in trouble because of stormwater runoff. And so it's very hard, I found. Donna and I traveled all over the state, about 450 miles of coastline, trying to find wild-caught oysters. And they were all from Maryland at the restaurants we went to. So that led me to think about how much the ecology of the South defines who we are as Southerners, our identity as Southerners. I mentioned I grew up in Atlanta. We could never have loved the earth so well if we had had no childhood in it. If it were not the earth where the same flowers come up again every spring that we used to gather with our tiny fingers. I was a pretty privileged kid. My grandparents lived on Lake Forest Drive, north of Buckhead. They had 5 acres and they grew everything and they taught me a lot. When my grandmother died, my aunt turned to me at the funeral and said, you know, your grandmother could name every flower on her casket by both its Latin and its common name. That was a great privilege. Memory as a way of invoking the past becomes an important vehicle for involving the community in environmental preservation, conservation, and participation. Carolyn Finney has written a book about nature as white space, that white people feel safe in nature in the South, but some Black people have had bad experiences in the woods, and we all know that. Found a little bit of that in Alabama in my travel of 6 states looking at endangered plants. But that memory of plants, of eating particular foods is in us all, and we have some of the world's most important biodiversity hotspots here in the South, and they're endangered. So we all need to remember how much this greenery means to who we are. So I followed my curiosity about our native plant treasures, and I visited, you know, as a kid, beautiful places on vacations. I went to the coast, I went to the mountains. I claimed it as part of my growing up. And I wanted to find out the species that are endangered, because when we lose one, we lose a bit of ourselves. Whoops, did I just turn this off? Okay. So I found a dozen plants. I picked them for their distribution across the South, and I picked them for their good stories. A lot of the plants are pretty rare and unusual, and people, unless you're a botanist, you may not have heard of them. But I'm going to talk tonight about 4 of these plants on a whirlwind tour, and tell you about the people who are working so hard to save them. Because when it finally got down to it, you can't interview a plant, right? But the people who are working in the field, the people who are here as interns this summer, the people who are learning about botany, we owe them a great debt for their service. I'm sorry, I keep punching the wrong button. Donna Campbell and I looked for great stories, and this is the long game work that these folks are doing. This is at a pitcher plant garden at Auburn University, by the way, which is quite astounding. So I was raised to pay attention to plants, but not kids so much nowadays. And all of us as older folks, grandparents and parents, have an obligation to help children know more about the green world. We're all attracted to animals. Animals tend to be more charismatic than plants for us when we're young. A couple of botanists from the South developed a term called plant blindness. And it is that they, quote, say, most people in developed nations tend to see plants as merely a green, blurry backdrop for the animals and human-made objects that populate their visual field. So we see the butterfly, we don't necessarily see the flower and the backdrop. This plant blindness has caused an ongoing decline in conservation funding of plants and the study of botany. Botany departments are being condensed and folded into other departments. I met a young man, you'll meet him too, who was the only botany major at Auburn University in his class. But it's not just the funding and the study, it's also that, you know, kids spend too much time looking at digital screens, we all do, and we don't know how to distinguish one leaf from another. So weeding is a really important activity, to be able to tell the weeds from the beautiful other plants. So these researchers who coined the term plant blindness in 2006 interviewed high school seniors about what they knew about plants. 77% of the high school graduates they talked to had never grown a plant by themselves. That's a problem. 10% had never picked fruit from a tree. or couldn't remember any children's story that featured a plant. The endangered species list, which was begun in the 60s, as most of you can remember, protected only animals. It was a full decade before we added plants to the list. 3,000 endangered plants. So I'm going to tell you some stories about these plants and the people who are taking care of them. The Alabama canebrake pitcher plant here, the beautiful red, was discovered in 1974. Guess what? We still don't know fully 20% of the plants that we have under our care that are out there. They haven't been named and discovered. But these were discovered in 74 by a Michigan husband and wife team who were hiking in a paperwood forest, and they found the species, and it was immediately listed on the endangered list. The green pitcher plant also grows in northeast Alabama, and both of these pitcher plants are so charismatic to collectors, people who want to have them in their yard, have them in their collection, that they are being poached, which is a huge threat to some plants, being literally stolen, dug up, or destroyed. Today, environmental crimes are the 4th largest criminal enterprise in the world, following drug smuggling, counterfeiting, and human trafficking. So I picked these plants because of that threat, that particular threat of humans poaching the plants. Now, plant blindness really doesn't quite apply to carnivorous plants. We are fascinated by a plant that gets its meals by actually killing insects. That's kind of wild, and kids like that. Our curiosity and enthusiasm has been going on for a long time. Charles Darwin wrote a definitive book in 1875 on carnivorous plants. William Bartram, who was the first American-born botanist in the South, who traveled the South, was quite taken when he saw his first pitcher plants. Shall we analyze these beautiful plants, and since they seem cheerfully to invite us, how greatly the flowers of the yellow Sarracenia represent a silken canopy? So he drew this. It would look good hanging here. So this is Chuck Bird. He works for the Alabama Nature Conservancy. We got in touch with him and said we really wanted to see the canebrake pitcher plant blooming. And he said, well, you need to come to Alabama in May. Call me back. We'll set a date. Here's the coordinates, map coordinates you'll need to get to meet me. Okay, this was south of Birmingham at an undisclosed location, and we were sworn to secrecy. Okay, and so we drive to this place that we find on Google Maps, and it's kind of scary. We pulled into a driveway, and then after about 20 minutes of waiting, and we're getting nervous that we were in the wrong place, here comes this big white truck that pulls in behind us and blocks us in, and then we're even more nervous. My editor's loving this story. She says, oh, a crime scene. This will sell books. I said, not exactly. Well, it was Chuck, of course, and he was in his burn truck. He conducts controlled burns of areas that are replenished best by controlled burning. So he took us into the forest, and we learned very soon that in this part of Alabama, they grow pine trees. They plant them so close together that nothing else survives in the understory. So the pitcher plants are already in trouble because they can't get sunlight or water sufficient to grow now that these forests are built. So when these particular canebrake pitcher plants were found, the Conservancy got the property, thinned out the pine trees, made it a better habitat for these rare pitcher plants. But there are only 6 sites in Alabama left. So that's what it looks like. People love the little cap that hangs over the pitcher. And what's so interesting is, of course, that keeps the rainwater out, so the juices down in the bottom don't get diluted and the insects will be killed. The other interesting thing is, of course, that cap is very enticing to insects, but pitcher plants, and we did get to see them blooming. See the seeds here in the little pouch? These are their gorgeous blooms. The blooms emit one scent to attract the pollinators, and the neck of the pitcher has another scent to attract different insects they want to eat. Pretty brilliant plant. The Native Americans used an extraction from these pitcher plants to treat diabetes. And that's another important point, is we're losing these plants. We don't know what they are, what they do. And if they become endangered, we can't test them to see what their medical properties would be because they're endangered. So it's an irony. Here's a close-up again of those incredible blossoms. And you think they look pretty big, but they're actually rather tiny. And when we got to the pitcher plants, Chuck said, you know, I could have stepped on these if I didn't know what we were looking for. And indeed, they were surrounded by wild blueberry plants and they were quite small, but it was thrilling to find them. So the next day, with Chuck's advice, we went to find the green pitcher plants. Well, we went to this DeSoto Park in Alabama, which is up on Lookout Mountain. You may know DeSoto Park in the northeast part of Alabama. This green pitcher plant was first documented in 1900, and it grows mostly on private property, which means it's not protected. Only rare plants on public property, government property, can be enforceably protected. So because it grows on private property, it's endangered. There are mountainous spots in Georgia and North Carolina that have a single population each of this green pitcher plant. And when we got to DeSoto Park, we asked the people at the visitor center where we saw this poster, where we could see the actual pitcher plants, and they said, we have a display outside. They didn't want us to go see them in the wild because just a month before we got there, a teacher had brought school kids to see the pitcher plants. They also have lady slippers and other exotic, well, not exotic, but wonderful native plants that look exotic in DeSoto Park. And a week after the school kids had visited, somebody dug them all up, took them away. So now they just don't tell people where the pitcher plants are. But they had this wonderful display that was created by an Eagle Scout for his project. And you can really tell how gorgeous the plants are. This is Noah Yon, the botany major at Auburn I mentioned. He is going to be a big deal in our territory, taking care of plants. And he's just an extraordinary student. He fell in love with pitcher plants when his grandmother gave him a carnivorous plant when he was 11, which he promptly killed, and trying to feed it hamburgers. And then he got into pitcher plants and he started growing them in his mother's kitchen in what they came to be known as the plantry. So these are his original pitcher plants he's had since he was about 14. And he finally took them and put them back in nature recently. Noah, when he was still a teenager, was hired by Atlanta Botanical Gardens to help a botanist, a research botanist, to document, take a census of all the pitcher plants that had been documented in 1995 by Atlanta Botanical Garden, before Noah was born, okay? So he goes out and goes to a site where they had collected some seeds of the green pitcher plant, and this is what he found. Well, pitcher plants don't look great year-round. But the people who own this private property said, so what's so great about this? Are you all going to take our land? I mean, what are you doing here? And he said, I just wanted to see if these plants are still here. And they said, well, what's so great about these plants? So Noah called Emily Coffey, who's the research director at Atlanta Botanical Garden, and asked her if she would give free passage to this family to come see the pitcher plants in the garden. And they went. And they saw the plants that had been grown from their seeds in the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and now they're enthusiastic supporters of saving this plant. Also at Auburn, they have a facility where they grow and cultivate pitcher plants to outplant, to build a population in the wild. It's not ideal, but it's what we've got to do to save some of these plants. So these are 2 trays of green pitcher plants. And as Noah pointed out, this is his boss, Patrick, who was a funny guy. He said, you know, I love to hoard things. And I think botany is a really good job for me because I can just get all these plants here at Auburn. Anyway, for the species as a whole, only 6,000 plants remain in the wild. So that's more than remains in the wild of these green pitcher plants. Okay, on to the second plant, Moorfield's leatherflower. This is sort of a sweet story. I remember clematis or clematis, depending on which you say. My grandmother grew them. A lot of people twine them up their mailboxes or somewhere in their property, and I've noticed in the South, if you drive down the street, if somebody's got a clematis, some neighbors will have them too in their yards, you know, it kind of catches on as a thing. But I had never seen these bell-shaped flowers. I always saw the saucer-shaped clematis. This was discovered in Alabama in 1982. It's also called the Huntsville leatherflower, and it's only found in northern Alabama, but now they've discovered it in Tennessee and Georgia as well. It was discovered by a college student, a college sophomore, who had grown up in California. His father worked on the space shuttle project, and they ended up moving to Huntsville, Alabama when he was in high school, which didn't make him very happy. So he went to college at Deep Springs back in California, and in his last semester of his sophomore year, he took a botany class and he was hooked. It seems to happen to kids, these kids I've met, these people who are working so hard. Something bites, the bug bites. Jim found this unusual vine with its beautiful flowers on the side of a mountain near Huntsville, and he was taking a gap year before he went on to go back to college, finish college. But he took all the plant specimens he collected that summer to a man named Robert Krall, who was a very distinguished botanist in Tennessee at Vanderbilt. And Krall was kind enough to look through his samples. This is what the flowers look like when they change and produce seeds. Krall pulled that particular specimen out and he said, I think you've got something here. May I keep this? And, you know, Jim said, sure. So he went back to college. He graduated, and then he was accepted to graduate school. And when he was just starting his PhD program at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden in California, he got a letter from Robert Krall saying the plant had been named for him, Moorfield's leatherflower. What a way to start grad school. So now the plant is at Huntsville Botanical Garden where you can see it. They are also cultivating it for outplanting. And this young woman, Tracy Cook, grew up in Huntsville, visited the botanical gardens, was fascinated, just taken by the whole scene when she was a girl. Her family had to move out of Huntsville. She ended up in a single mother situation. She joined the Marine Corps. She learned to repair engines. She then got out of the Marine Corps and decided to study botany, and she got a job here, and she's now the curator of the Botanical Garden and Native Plants. She did her master's thesis using global information systems to try to predict where this particular Moorfield leatherflower might be growing based on soil, rain, other conditions. And indeed, she found another population for her thesis. She also teaches kids, and they do DNA testing in Huntsville because they've got all these labs there, and the kids learn about how to test the DNA of plants. So she's quite a great teacher and a fine person, another plant hero. This is a different clematis, a different Viorna, a member still of that same group that have the pitchers instead of the big flowers. And the good thing about clematis is they don't cross-pollinate. There are 4 kinds of these plants in Alabama, but you can see, we saw this one at a very rare spot in Alabama that Chuck took us to see, and it's not really at all like this one, so they're quite different. But fortunately, they don't crossbreed, but they're really in trouble from drought and from development and mining, and they prefer limestone glades, which happen to be in Alabama and are the site. There's one site in Alabama where they discovered 52 some plants, and 6 of them had never been seen before. It was at the site of an old iron mine that was built during the Civil War and had been left alone. We just can't leave things alone, you know? We mess it up. So these are some of the vines they're cultivating in Huntsville. And next I drove to Sewanee, the University of Tennessee, the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. This is Montego Mountain, you can see in the distance with that building. And I was on my way to meet with their biological department. It turns out the domain at the University of the South, which is what they call the campus, the domain, the acreage they have, has one endangered species, and it's Moorfield's leatherflower. It was discovered by the Tennessee state botanist Todd Crabtree and verified by another Tennessee botanist named Dwayne Estes. I got to meet with Professor John Evans and two of his amazing students who also gave me hope for the future. These two, Lillian grew up homeschooled in Mississippi. She already knows she wants to get a PhD in botany. And Angus has been studying floods and its effect on plants. And he also is in the fellows program there. He's from Decatur, Georgia. John Evans, turned out was a pal who went to Duke, which was my alma mater. And we just had a wonderful afternoon talking about these plants. And they're holding up an herbarium specimen, which is, a pressed plant on a sheet of paper. I mentioned Dwayne Estes because when he was part of verifying this pressed version of the Moorfield leatherflower, he realized that what botanists used to do to put plants in presses, when you've got a plant like the leatherflower that's three-dimensional, really three-dimensional, doesn't press well. You can't smell the specimen, of course, it's lost all of its scent. And so we're very lucky that we have DNA testing now to be able to learn more about different species. But this is the traditional way, I'm sure you all know, that preserved samples and specimens of plants are kept. And there's more about that in the book, which is a very interesting story to me. Now we move to the Schweinet sunflower. It's kind of a weed. It loves rotten soil. It loves dry land. It grows in the Uwharrie National Forest here in North Carolina. It's protected at the North Carolina Zoo. It's also in a nature preserve north of Charlotte. It really gets ruined by spraying and mowing. And there are only about 9 populations left in North Carolina. But this is one that's protected, and you can go just drive down this road and see it. So if you get the book, you'll know how to find it. The town of Charlotte, the city of Charlotte, decided it is its signature endangered plant, which is a wonderful thing for a town to adopt a plant, claim it, save it, promote it, and get some good publicity, right? So that's one of the things I talk about in the book, is how we can all get involved in making plants more visible and helping places that have these plants use that as a possible identity. So this sunflower definitely attracts butterflies, and it's also in a handful of counties in South Carolina. But here's the really interesting history. This is the root system of the Schweinet sunflower. It looks like a Jerusalem artichoke, and apparently the Catawba Indian tribe used to eat it as a food source. So now the Catawba tribe, which has been through a lot of troubles over the years, has reconstituted itself in South Carolina. This is where the headquarters are for the tribe, and they got their federal recognition in 1993, and now they have a beautiful cultural center and a $50 million settlement with the government, and they wanted to grow Schweinet sunflowers so that the tribe could taste a bit of their history. But they can't grow it on public land because it's endangered. So if the tribe wants to grow this, they have to grow it on private land. Enter Rue de Laslin. De Laslin Rue George Warren, his last name is George Warren. He's an opera singer who graduated from Vanderbilt. He was a John Lewis Fellow. He ended up coming home and teaching himself the Catawba language. The last living speaker of the Catawba language, which is a Siouan language, died in the 60s. He's teaching kids how to speak Catawba. He is also teaching them how to garden. And so we got to tour his gardens that he does every summer on the near the cultural center. and he plants all of the traditional plants and also some exotic plants so the kids understand the difference between what's native and what's not. This is his corn rematriation project. The Georgia aster, which is an endangered species that has been now revived in Georgia, grows easily on the land, as does the swine sunflower. So it got its name because it was discovered in the 1800s by this Moravian preacher who used to ride horseback from church to church, but what he really wanted to do was look at plants on the way. He was a nut for mushrooms, and so he was a great artist and loved mushrooms and drew all kinds of wonderful paintings, which are in the UNC library. But he also discovered cannabis near Winston-Salem. Anyway, that was his story. So my final plant for you is one that is not endangered. It's river cane. People think bamboo is an exotic plant that some fool was dumb enough to plant and it took over, you know, this Asian grass. But actually, in North Carolina, we have 3 species of native bamboo. And river cane is the largest one. There's also an Appalachian cane that grows here in the mountains. It's deciduous. And then there is switch cane that grows in the eastern part of the state. Why do we care about river cane? We only have 2% left of what used to grow in the region. It is a wonderful habitat. This is what it looks like. And if you study some of the people do plant Asian bamboo and regret it, but this is native. And if you read the history, there were huge swatches of this stuff growing in the South, and animals, butterflies, birds depend on it for habitat. So we have endangered species that depend on this cane for habitat. Great place to find wild turkeys when back in the day. Mice, shrews, swamp rabbits, voles take shelter and feed on the cane seed, which is erratically produced. And the canebrake rattlesnake got its name from this bamboo. It grows in the same moist places that the canebrake pitcher plant grows. Soil near the water near the surface of the soil. It works great as a windbreak for farmers who are looking to, protect their crops and plant cane along the edges. This is in Tennessee, where a healthy stand of cane has been overtaken by other plants, and so there are folks working very diligently to hand remove the plants that are getting in the way of the cane. This is that long game, hard work stuff that conservationists do. Bison, elk, and bear particularly love cane. And it's a great place. It's also a great carbon sink. So it actually takes in carbon. And it can be planted and constrained and even put in urban areas to create barriers or decoration or something green. So it's just not as bad, and it gets a bad rap. But it also has been an important factor for the Cherokee people for 3,000 years. We went to see the river cane baskets in Cherokee made by the tribe, the artisans in the tribe. And there's a revitalization of traditional Cherokee artist resources. A nonprofit started to get river cane planted so folks can have what they need to keep making these baskets. Right now, the cane that's available to the tribe in Cherokee in North Carolina is not adequate to the needs, and they still have a treaty with Barbersville, Kentucky, and they go and collect river cane every year in Kentucky to continue making their baskets. This is a wonderful woman we met, Ramona Lawsey, who is now one of the elder basket makers in the tribe, and here's what she told me. River cane was a good babysitter and teacher when I was a child. My sister and I would sit around while my mom was weaving. You learn what you see. I learned to put my things in order for weaving. I learned to count in the Cherokee language with my grandma as part of the weaving. You are raised a certain way and it shows in respect for your elders. My girls were raised this way, making baskets, and it shows with them too. In our culture, you are disciplined by your elders, and it's not a bad thing. Little native kids don't scream. That's because our elders were soft-spoken. You learn to put yourself in your weaving. No need to growl at anyone. No loud noises. Her daughters are now making story baskets. So their baskets tell a story, and the patterns in the baskets all have particular symbolic meaning. This is Ramona's work, and this basket fits in the palm of my hand. It's a tiny, tiny piece of cane that she uses. She says nothing is wasted. Would that we had that wisdom. Now we move to one more site, Panola Mountain State Park, south of Atlanta. Some of you may be familiar with this. Like I said, I grew up in Atlanta, but I've never heard the South River. And there's a reason. Here's a Stone Mountain from Panola Mountain, so you get the idea of sort of where we are. Delta jets flying slowly and low overhead, yeah, headed to Hartsfield, Jackson. This is Jackie Eccles, and she's president of the South River Watershed Association. They took on a project to plant river cane on the shores of the South River down here in Panola Mountain State Park to secure the banks, to have a windbreak, to bring back birds, and we saw incredible bluebirds and killdeers in the field. But she took us on a hop through this landscape, which was kind of wet because it had rained that morning. She graduated, well, she's born and raised in Tuskegee. She graduated from Clark, Atlanta, earned a PhD in political science, but her thing is environmental advocacy. She was chair of the Atlanta Tree Commission and primary spokesperson for the Clean Streams Task Force in Atlanta, and now she's working on the South River. Her organization is working very hard to get people engaged in this river, and I'm going to show you where it is. It's the headwaters are over there where 75 and 85 and 35 are, and it flows this way to the east, and that's Panola Mountain State Park in the green. So it's really south of Atlanta, and the scariest thing is that its headwaters were basically buried way back when. This is where the headwaters were. They run through a culvert pipe. And on the other side of this part of the expressways, there were cotton plants. And the refuse from the cotton processing was stored in lagoons. And so when the South River emerges on the other side of this, from the culverts, it's an eerie blue color, kind of foamy, because that stuff is still in the soil. It flows along through golf courses and neighborhoods of all sorts on the other side of Atlanta, and another traffic jam. This is what it looks like in proximity to the city. Well, it eventually cleans itself up enough to allow for fishing, although I wouldn't eat the fish. But Jackie's group gets out and cleans the river. They clean the shores. They have tire collection days. And they worked very hard to promote recreation on the river, because if it's cleared for fishing, that's one thing. The next category up in water quality is recreation. DeKalb County has not done a good job with their water and sewer system, and they have lots of unfortunate breaks and spills, a lack of capacity to keep this river clean. So Jackie's been working pretty tirelessly on this. And somewhere on its downstream route, it does get better and allow for fishing, but not recreation. But I just heard from Jackie a few weeks ago saying they've finally gotten a recreation designation. So they've improved at least a stretch of the river. We walked on down to the shore so we could see the river. We walked through the cane, and this is a steep drop off. And again, the use of the cane is to protect the banks, to keep things in place. She organizes 6-mile kayak trips in the summer down the river, and she said, you know, you just have to get people out on the river to see its potential. Then we saw this, we turned around and we saw this break in the cane, and I'm like, what is that? And she said, oh, feral hogs, they wallow in here. And I'm like, she saw the look on my face, she said, you hear them coming, don't worry. Georgia is third after Florida and Texas in the number of feral hogs that roam wild in the state. And they are a major problem with endangered plants and certain ecosystems. Some of you may know that and have known it, but they've been called one of the most challenging invasive species in the South. We got out of there pretty fast. So there's the river cane growing well. And I asked Jack, I said, so, you know, the environmental movement has traditionally been mostly white folks. How is it being a woman of color going into these situations and working on this issue? And she said, you know, if that helps, I'll take it. She said, I think I've gotten in places I might not have gotten into because of it. And this river needs all the help it can get. And she's recently gotten Coca-Cola involved. And so it's, you know, she's working every weekend on this river's improvement and the plans thereof. So I haven't like given you a bunch of bullet points in this PowerPoint. I've tried to tell you some stories. I'd be interested to hear from you what you heard, what you learned from this, or if you have any questions for us now that I've covered the ground. Yes, ma'am.
And how successful are the endeavors to spread, to reintroduce this?
They're pretty successful. We should all be very proud of Atlanta Botanical Garden. It is a regional leader. It is a Southeastern organizer. It's working not just in the United States, but in the Caribbean. And I don't know, maybe that's kind of a benefit of working at Atlanta Botanical, is you get to go to the beach a lot, but it's really very hard work. And they're being pretty successful, although outplanting cultivated plants, rare species in the wild is not ideal, you know, but it is what we have to do for certain species. And there are several success stories in the book that are, we can credit Atlanta Botanical to some degree. Yes, sir.
Would it be possible for you to find that picture you took of the nation seal?
Sure.
I was intrigued by that graphic. Way back.
Yeah, it was. I haven't studied that graphic at great length, but this is slide. Y'all, we had fun doing this book. Donna Campbell, do you have anything you'd like to say?
You know, you're going by these pictures pretty fast.
These are her, this is her work.
Good job.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's.
I'm intrigued by whatever that is in the middle of that.
You mean not the person? What is
Not the
it?
person.
You think it's the head of a animal, maybe?
I think it's the root. It's the root of the plant, part of it, I think, I don't know.
Stump.
You know what? Give me your address, I'll get back to you on that. I'll find out. I'll write Rue and ask it. They just got a big grant, by the way, to do more work. Yes.
So you picked out 10 or 12 plants that are threatened but have champions. How many other plants are don't necessarily have champions?
You know, the way that the system works is a plant has to get studied and they have to prove its rarity, basically. I'm now putting this in very general terms. And then someone has to do a study of what would it take to get the populations back up to a level they don't have to worry about. And they're in the hundreds, mostly handled at the state level. And each state has slightly different ways of dealing with it. And so part of the challenge is the Southeastern Conservation Alliance is working hard to create sort of a general rule of how to take care of plants, how to effectively work with partners like nonprofits, like Coca-Cola corporates and university partners, and build these partnerships so that it's a big team with many resources working on saving these. And Nothing that I know of recently has winked out, as they say in the business, but they're close. And somebody here might answer that better than me, but there are hundreds.
But I think part of what I think you said the last time you did was that botany departments are disappearing from college. Kids are not interested in plants anymore, which
Yeah.
is not helpful.
Yeah, people are not interested in plants, and yet, you know, those heroes that I point out to you here are amazing people who somehow got hooked. And a lot of them got hooked as kids. Everybody had, almost to a person, had a story about when their grandparent brought them a frog, or they went someplace, you know, and discovered these amazing plants and they got interested. And so it's our job to make sure kids are having these opportunities to get out and see what the title of my next book, I think, is The Fabulous Ordinary. You know, to see these miraculous things in the wild or in curated spaces or guided tours, to know what's really out there and get out from behind the computer screen, you know.
Pottery. That's what
Pottery, okay, thank you.
I believe. My father.
Pottery.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
What is the legal reason that they can't be planted on public lands, or is it just because on public lands, public will come and it won't be worth it?
No, it can be planted on public land, but if it is endangered, it can't be moved or, you know, it's gotta be protected. Whereas on private land, you can plant. And one thing I've told people is if you own some land that might be of interest to the Highlands Center or to the Atlanta Botanical Garden, you know, you might be able to be one of those places where the rare plants are outplanted. We went to Florida to see a yew tree. You have one right out here. This is one of the few destinations for the Toria tree, which grows in Florida in the Apalachicola region and is dying of a fungus, and the climate is changing. But they do okay up here, but they also are subject to the fungus. So we met two ladies in their 80s who took us out on their property. We about gave out, trying to hike up the hills with them to show us where they're letting Atlanta Botanical Garden plant seedlings, put all kinds of equipment around the seedlings and study what is going on with this Toria tree. So you can volunteer to play a part, and these organizations get permission to come on your land and do some conservation work. Anything else?
Okay,
Oh,
well,
we got one more, we got one more.
I just want to mention that two things. One is Dwayne Estes, who mentioned it.
Dwayne,
Yeah, Dwayne teaches here. If he was a student back in probably 2001, 2002, took a botany course. I can't say that, I think he's probably already interested in it. But, so this, the Harvard observation indirectly has played a role in that.
Yes, Dwayne is a great character, and he's the last chapter of the book. He took us to a site in Tennessee to see where a plant used to grow. I thought we might see a specimen. He said, oh, the last of the Schwalbia was here in 1930. And I said, we just hiked all this way. And he's a trip. Now, he's another great story. He told me his whole life story, and it's fascinating. He was a bad student who discovered plants and he's now running the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, which is protecting the prairies that used to be in the South. We think, oh, it's always been forested. He learned in middle school that the people who arrived on the ships, the Mayflower in Jamestown, in North Carolina, and down in St. Augustine, if you saw a squirrel in a tree when you got off the boat, that squirrel could walk all the way to the Mississippi River from the tops of trees and never have to hit the ground. Well, that was not true. There were lots of prairies in the South that we've now let grow up into forests, and the seed bank that's underground of amazing plants is waiting to be liberated and to have a chance to to be a part of our environment.
Well, let's give it up to Georgann. Georgann has graciously brought some of her books with her. Be sure to stop by, grab a tree, grab a snack, and she will be out there to sign some books for you all.
Thank you all.
Be sure to come back next week.
So much better.